Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Can everybody still see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. So as you have noticed upon joining today's webinar, everyone has been placed on mute for the presentation. At the end of the presentation, there might be a Q&A session, but go ahead and enter your questions into the questions box and click enter, and if we don't have time to get to them at the end of the webinar, our wonderful panelists will be coming through your questions, answering them, and then we'll send the answers out to all of our attendees. So thank you very much for registering for today's webinar, and I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to Mary.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. This is the third webinar in our interoperability series with WEDI for all of you faithful followers. We've learned a lot during this process through our surveys and through the conversations we've had with people after webinars or during the conferences. And what we've learned is that even today, many people still have a negative view of the proposed rules and of interoperability as a whole. They consider it a burden, a headache, or even a nightmare. So with Halloween around the corner, we decided to use that, make that our topic for this webinar. So Greg, if you can advance the slides, I'll go over the agenda briefly. So first, Greg Prothero will highlight the ways the industry is pushing for interoperability and the reasons that some people view it as a nightmare. Then he'll unmask the terror and show you that interoperability isn't actually scary. It's a foundation for future success and an opportunity to improve member experience. And then Dave Foster will demonstrate how you can improve member experience and provide value by employing trusted interoperability use cases. And then finally, we'll provide you with best practices to achieving interoperability, regardless of your starting point. So with that, I will pass the baton on to Greg.
Great. Mary, thank you so much. And once again, thank everyone for joining us on Tuesday on another WEDI webinar. We've taken, as Mary mentioned, we've been working with a lot of people who are on the call today. We've actually spoken to a lot of people who are on the call and working with directly to kind of gain some of this knowledge, right, and some of this insights. Right off the bat, I'm going to say I'm not an expert with the NPRM rules, because right now they're still obviously in comment times and we don't have specific dates. But what we're seeing as best practices that are kind of coming out of this when we're working with our customers and our partners. So we're going to kind of discuss that and sort of the trend and how you can see that moving forward. So let's get started. So through the last three webinars, we've actually asked the same question: where are we really with, where you are really with your planning for meeting interoperability, proposed rules. And so a couple of things have kind of came out of here. Really, we only have a small position of people who are really kind of on pace and are actually starting to do, what would you say, like actively doing like pilots and production use of for interoperability. And you can see the laggards are slowly, pretty much just learning. And I'm hoping that these webinars will advance those into a planning stage. And I think that's, if you take anything out of today, would be just understand what is necessary. And if you're not having those conversations internally, start doing either internal planning or kind of a gap assessment to make sure that you are in line to meet these when the actual dates do come through. So, pick where you are potentially here. We've actually done a series of surveys to find out, kind of where we're at and where everyone's been. And we surveyed maybe over 200 and probably more now organizations. And I think this lines up with what I've been reading as well online. So I just wanted to put that out there. And we want everyone, obviously to be successful here. So we want to make sure we get you educated and then you start getting into planning phases as quickly as possible. So let's get right into it. And this is a journey. So we're not saying that there's a magic ball or a magic wand for any of this stuff. But I've done this presentation just a couple of times, and the one thing that I love to set up is the context of why. And today is the setup of a nightmare. And potential members have nightmare experiences with us, payers and providers, right? But everyone understands that they might know a story which could have been improved by better interoperability between, either data sharing or the interactions between a payer and member, or even a provider and member, or the whole ecosystem working better together. And so I'm not going to go through a specific script here, but I think you can fill in the blanks to say a member going to potentially a primary, how did they find that primary? Is it the right primary, right? Or is it the clinician? I mean, if you move to a new state, how would you find the right PCP? How do you schedule this? And would the payer be involved in a potential scheduling because they're in network? And how does that work, right? And currently it's manual, fax calls, whatever. But we see that that's still kind of a challenge spot when we first engage members. Second might be a referral to a specialist, in this instance, cardiologist. But the idea that that data might be limited. If it is in network, you're probably better off. But if it's out of network, then how do you share historical data, including claim and clinical data, right, to your the actual specialist or whomever is going to be providing care? How do you share that? And right now we feel that's kind of limited. We think that we're still kind of standardizing that, so we're limited in how we share data. And then when it comes to these big ticket items of a big procedure, are we accurately getting what our coverage is, like copays, and and how much will this cost us from a member perspective? And this is key. If it's inaccurate, that can reduce the experience, the member's experience, and also make it very difficult to move forward on needed procedures. After potentially a visit to the ER or a surgery, you have these follow-ups. These are doctor's notes that are very important. There could be discharge therapies, there could be medication, there could be notes for care plans. These need to be distributed right now. Everyone probably understands ADTs, right? They go between EMR systems, and that works pretty well. But what about the extended care teams? What about the payer care teams that need to get these alerts? They've got to be included into these workflows so everyone's alerted when things happen and when things are being followed up on. And then finally, to make sure that there's a quality ending, right? We want to reduce errors, and the errors could be a big issue when it comes to adverse reactions, especially if they're taking medications that could create some type of side effect. And so these are some of the nightmare scenarios that potentially could happen along a member engagement throughout this course. So we're going to kind of pick up a couple of these with our use cases to show how we might be able to change that around. But first, let's think about the ecosystem, and everyone probably has seen this, the big players, right? How everything works together. But there has been now a little bit of a shift into how the consumer plays their role, right? How the consumer, member, and patient, if however you look at them, how are they going to play a role? And really, the consumer might be generating their own content. I put the little moped here because it might not be a ton of information. Might even be SDOH information, kind of like information that they've been capturing on the IoT devices, but it's not a lot of data. But they're going to start managing this data somehow, right? Hopefully, we'll give them the ability to start making decisions on theirs. Really, the health plan has really gotten involved, right? So the payers on those calls, you're being very involved in really, the actual care planning, right? The care interventions. You're collecting the claim encounters. You're doing authorizations. You really understand the back end, right, of what's happened with this member. And then if we shift to the dump truck, and that's why I put the truck here, is whoa, how much information do we have at a clinical side on a patient, right? This is the clinical side, which you can say HL7, CCD, and all of the acronyms there, but this is a ton of information that now needs to come together, and you can see overlapping. How does this create a 360-degree view of the patient member? And this is what we're talking about, really expanding and hopefully standardizing this data so it can be used effectively. So as we move forward, mandates help us say, oh, how do I do this, right? What's the kind of the framework and move forward? And then we keep on using this word interoperability, and then we keep on shifting every year. It shifts kind of a focus on what interoperability really means. And I kind of, jest here, I said, traditionally interoperability just meant moving all of that data, right? That car worth of data, that motorcycle worth of data, and that dump truck of data, moving it between systems effectively, right? That used to be interoperability, right? And meaningful use, making sure that it's meeting that meaningful use. But now we're kind of shifting into more of what does it mean in the patient context, right? Do we take that patient and say, all right, are we doing the right thing at the right time? Are we providing the care, and do we understand it? Do you understand the patient's situation, and what kind of practice needs to know at the time it needs to be known? So really, what programs and kind of VBC programs or quality efforts or incentives or whatever that needs to be happen is happening effectively. And so the left-hand side, we're going to kind of talk about mandates plowing this street, right, and making sure that we scale and these highways become, kind of passable. But then we have to think about this care and context and really say, all right, are we using this effectively? And so it really is kind of a two-edged sword. And we've all been saying, all right, interoperability is IHE, or it's connecting of EMR systems, or we're payer provider, releasing clinical data, and we're sharing claim data, payer provider. We're doing this, but as I mentioned, there has been a kind of a shift when CMS said, look, the consumer, if we give the consumer this data, right, they can now share this data, or they can direct who should get this and how it should be. How it should be either shared or utilized. That doesn't take away that payers and providers are not going to be doing this. We're just saying that there's going to be a shift to saying, all right, we now have to open up structured data or some other this data, not only between payers and providers, but now it might be a payer and a payer sharing data because a consumer wants to change plans, or they want to go somewhere out of network, and so they now have control. And I said, we hear this word FHIR, we're going to hear APIs, right? These are all ways to kind of make sure that we're enabling these effectively, and that's sort of standardizing how we move data. So I use the whole, the street concept, and that's what I kind of want to use as a, coming together, how things work. For a while, we at FX, and then also the industry as a whole, right, have been working on connecting systems at a baseline, right, building connectors, exchanging the proprietary protocols between systems, and really building out those interfaces, right? That's been kind of a long haul for us, and for a lot of the actually vendors who are on the call. Then we started standardizing transactions. So obviously X12, HIPAA, MCDPD, HL7, and now FHIR. So now we're structuring, the way we move data and how it is and how it's formed. And now we're actually standardizing processes, the SLAs, how it moves. And then the data content is actually structured. So, we know what we're moving. And so you can actually say CAQH, or the operating rules, is a process that we're standardizing. You can actually take some of the Da Vinci use cases and use that as an example of standardizing not only the process because they have implementation guides, but also then you move to what data stores it is. And so if you're doing Blue Button, you might be going down a CPCDS kind of data model, or if you're going directly into the NPRM interoperability, moving the standardizing all data, you might start thinking that use CDI. So these are standardized data formats. So that's all well and good. All right, we're doing this, right? Everybody in the industry is starting to do this, and we're doing it, I think, pretty effectively. We could do better. Now we have to start thinking futuristically and saying, all right, how does that patient data really move, and how do we kind of stitch together what we've been doing on the left-hand side, moving and transacting data, to really understand the context of that data and where it needs to go and when it needs to be moved. So that's why I wanted to there's something in the middle of these, there's a kind of a bridge in the middle that actually shows content moving and where it needs to go at the right place. Just kind of keeping to the metaphor. So a lot of us on this call understand that there's protocols that we use on a day-to-day basis, right? It's gonna, if you call real time, you might be using REST, right? Web services. You might get into security and OAuth and all of the old school, MLP and secure file transfer. All these ways to move data. Then you start thinking about some of the actual transaction types, right? And then all the way down to the bottom hand is how we store the data. So these are all part of going up and down the data exchange kind of model, OSI model, if you were for that. And we have to come, there might be mapping, there might be, moving back and forth in versions. And then on the right-hand side is, where did we capture this information? Where is this information going? Is it a care delivery? Is it billing support? Did it come from an IoT device, right? And then what is the terminology that we're using so we're speaking the same language, and how to kind of normalize that? So if we undo that again, is system connections, standardized connections, and common data processes. And on the right-hand side would be capturing technology, capturing process, and then terminology. All these things working together kind of give you that three-dimensional view of the data of the member, right? And then how we interact with that information. So if we keep on going and say, all right, now we know we have to move patient data in context. How are we going to do this, right? And with the interoperability kind of mandates is pushing towards APIs, standardized APIs. Where do we put that into our framework today? On the left-hand side, we've already connected, other provider or partner systems. Could be labs, could be provider networks, right? MCOs, if you will, IDNs. You have clearinghouses, all connecting you potentially through B2B engines, right? Managed file transfer engines, and they're all connected and moving data into your system. That's called then it goes into some type of system integration, whereas data is being stored transactionally for SLAs, right? For compliance, for event monitoring and audits. You might actually be storing that data for an operational use. That could be the adjudication system or membership. And now we actually start seeing FHIR servers or FHIR repositories being used at an operational level. And then potentially your system is a record, right? Big data, wherever you store everything, enterprise data warehouses, your clinical repositories, image repos. So you're bringing this data in, you're dumping it into silos, right? You're keeping them in stores. You might be normalizing it. But then you have these applications at the top that need to be fed, right? And we've added member apps up here on top of the left-hand side because those could be obviously a potential partner or an actual system or an application that could be internal or you move. So that's why it's on the left-hand side. But all these other ones should sound very familiar. Revenue cycle, consumer apps, right? Care apps, future apps, right? And where do we put APIs? Big question for your infrastructure and enterprise team is, do you create a new layer for APIs? Do you include those APIs into your current architecture? Where do you build this model? And you're going to start seeing probably enterprise architects come up and say, all right, we want to start putting APIs into the integration system or building that out, or we'll build out a new layer for APIs. I think in the near term, you'll start seeing hybrids where they both work together, because to pull data out of these repositories or these silos, it's going to take mapping, and those connections are still there. And then you might release it into a standard API for an application to consume. So you can see these working together and vice versa. I mean, maybe in the future it's all API driven, but I think with our networks, once you build a connection from like an ETL or an ESB or some other type of kind of, point-to-point connection to your internal systems, those will stay a while until there's a real big incentive to push off of it. So where you're getting the biggest bang is really the application and developing new applications and lines of business, and that's where the APIs might come in. So this is by all means not a recommendation of what your framework would look like, but just the idea that framework might change because we're moving more to an API or a kind of a web service type approach, which will support real-time transactions. All right. So I think we have our first survey question. Sam, I'm not sure if you're going to do this one, if you load it up. So do you currently expose any of the following data to your members? And I mean, if you're a provider, then you can say, patient. So anyone from a consumer perspective, what do you expose, right? Are you exposing that EOB information, claims, kind of financial information? Is it just claim information or historical claims? Potentially, are you storing lab information on your members, and are you exposing that? And then any kind of medication notes. And then finally, are you ready to share everything? So let's open that up. Hey, Sam, do you see it? I don't see the.
Yeah, so far we have 40%, and it's still popcorning up. So
Okay, I just can't see it. So yeah, if you could just tell me what they are, and I could comment on. I'm sorry, just for some reason it's not. I don't see the polling coming up on mine.
Yep. So right now it's 64% EOB, 40% claims, 25% labs, 29% medication history, and 22% all patient data.
I like it. I like seeing 22%. Actually, that seems like it adds up to more. But I mean, it's what that sounds like to me is, you know, people are going down the blue button approach, right, where they're exposing EOB, right, and then they're starting with claim data. And what I like to hear is that 22% of all data, because some people are really getting ready for the interoperability, you know, the standardizing, you know, and getting ready to actually share all data. So that's really good news. Can we close that out yet?
Yep, it's back to your screen.
All right, great. So let's keep on moving forward. That's good numbers though, because I was surprised that we're ready to do all data yet. So that's good news. That's good to hear. So moving, you know, using kind of this nightmare, we hope to, you know, spawn an opportunity, right, for you and your internal teams to take this as an opportunity to be better, right, to be best, if you will. I mean, it's the idea. This is not a nightmare. The idea that you can use this regulation to incentivize or kind of use as a trigger or a motivation to improve services. And we have the context of a member engagement, but it also can improve, you know, your other, you know, areas of business, right? Really providing better value to your stakeholders. And so this concept of providing access to healthcare data, we like to call it empowering members, but I also could say empowering the ecosystem to do better with more informed choices and improved overall outcomes. So this is the opportunity, if you have one, to say, all right, what did I want to do to, you know, to move the ball? And now you have a mandate, at least close to a mandate with a rule that states, all right, how to do it. And so you can start planning on, you know, how will this all work together? And we've heard numerous that if you do go down, you know, the clinical and claim data, make sure you collaborate. You know, it's a collaboration between probably multiple organizations in your business. So if that's possible, you have to collaborate across. If you are starting specifically with claims, then great. Figure out how you could do better with just the claim data that you have and moving forward. So that's a kind of a great thing of like, you know, where can we have impacts? And remember, I told you I wasn't going to get into the actual rules themselves, but we see these driving and potential impact areas, and we've shown this a couple of times. There's 5 areas. What would we be? One was the actual sharing of information, which is going to be a task in itself. That means not only sharing data potentially to a competitor, right, a payer, you have to actually have to receive data as well. So you have to be ready to receive this information. So hopefully that'll improve by really engaging the member, right, the member information, where they can be more informed in their decisions. I mentioned the historical data. It's mentioned that you still have to store all the data past 5 years past enrollment. So anytime a member goes back, they can request their information, request their data that they have rights to. This will help them understand, you know, their costs, potentially some transparency. You know, it will probably open up, you know, differentiators of maybe some formularies of you know, costs. This is kind of a controversial area of what this data might be used for, but still, the idea that you have to share this information is going to be part of the rule. You can use this potentially for care coordination if they're moving plans or moving through different programs, be able to reduce medical errors, non-compliance, and really close those gaps. And then we get into the last 2, all right, which is really how do you use provider directories if they're updated with resource like FHIR links, right, or direct information. That will make it easier for members to be able to find providers and be able to share that information with them. And then trusted exchanges. This is sort of a growing area that TEFCA was just awarded to the Sequoia project, and they'll be coming out with their plans pretty soon on how to onboard. But this will allow, you know, instead of just states or just current regions to open it up globally or worldwide, if you will. So I'm not going to go through the checklist. Everyone should have seen this in some of our old webinars, but I think it brings to a point of, if you haven't already started planning, do you know what to do and what to talk about? And so here are 8 things, and we can send out the information as well, is get started. Have your team start identifying common areas where you need to start having conversations. So if you want to move toward interoperability, you have to understand where your data sources are, where your systems are record. How do you get to that data? All right, how are you going to implement a FHIR server, or are you going to FHIR enable data that you currently have? Are you going to work with a partner? Are you going to do it yourself? Probably seems to be the biggest one. Understanding open source technology with commercially available software, the pros and cons of that, something as an internal college you'll probably work with. You need to really verify what you have from an API integration layer and the capabilities you have within that platform or tooling. Make sure that has some security benefits, so you can do OAuth, because that's the standard for authentication. And then we'll talk about consent on the next slide. But and then finally, establish dynamic links between your infrastructure and your sources of data, being able to kind of walk up and walk down different versions. If they're legacy kind of maps, do they go to standardized maps? How do you work that? Understanding that is going to be kind of key to know, how to implement. On the right-hand side, really kind of create an implementation strategy towards standardized mapping. This will be key because a lot of your EMR vendors or vendor partners might have implemented an older version of FHIR. You'll need to support that, and then when the mandates come out, you might need it to avert the newest release of FHIR. So you might have version control that you have to deal with. OAuth, I mentioned that you have to support OAuth and all of the key exchanges there. Consent management is also new. If you have included this already somehow and you have some type of management of consent, then great. Those are all things that could be included into a process to making sure that data doesn't go to the wrong place. So that's something to make sure that you have a handle on. And then finally, some type of auditing system that can track all of this. Does it need to be data lineage? It needs to be auditing. Call it what you may, have to have something that you can actually keep compliance for all of your state and local regulations. All right, moving forward. I think everyone's familiar with where we came and where we're going. So I'm not going to mention like back when, but if you haven't built compliance into your framework, I think, and knowing that it's going to change, you've been spending a lot of money on building, new mandates into whatever you have as your infrastructure. Right now, we've taken this quote, and I think it's pretty good. It says 36% of health plans and 43% of health systems are using the ONC and the CMS rules as part of their broader interoperability strategy. So you can see that, way back from HIPAA all the way now into the uses of data standardization and data access. CMS and ONC have been kind of guiding us in our industry. So the big question, where to go, right? Are you if you're a payer, or if you're a public sector, or if you're Medicaid, right? Or you're covered entities, right? What do you do? And now this is not to say that if you're a line of business, you have to do this. This is sort of more of a time frame of when stuff came out and who adopted it. And so you'll see early on, Blue Button was really a CMS, Medicare, VA for A and B, right? But then 2.0, if you will, more of the Blue Button as we know it today, open APIs. The Medicare and CMS said, look, we've done this. We've opened up millions of data files, right, or data on our patients. You should be able to do the same. And so that's where some of the interoperability came through for these new data blocking rules, right, that are kind of forcing us to move down this track. You'll see some adoption to Karen, which is really some of the standards for Blue Button. Right, that's a data standardization for mapping claims and financial data, or the EOB resources, so you can actually exchange that information using sort of the Blue Button framework. And then finally, if you are Medicare, Medicaid, right, CHIP, you're under exchanges, if you're under a covered entity, right, and it's supported by, you have to meet this, well, then you need to start looking towards this UCDI, right, and really utilizing the complete interoperability kind of framework. And you can potentially start with the blue button and then increase, but if you are going to meet those mandates at a certain time, you need to start thinking about meeting those kind of data standards. So what are these? What are the data standards? Well, they become in reference models, right? If we standardize access, standardized data, and interoperability becomes really more the attainable goal. I split screen, I should have brought them out, not at one, but if you go down blue button, if you think the blue button is on your plan, you need to start picking Karen or blue button IG, sort of the historical kind of implementation guides. Those data sources, as I mentioned, will be clinical, they'll be claim in nature, right? There'll be financial data, they'll come from your claim systems, membership data, billing systems. You'll be using claim information, right? All the way down the bottom, you'll see that the different resources that you'll probably be working with is EOB, patient and coverage, supplemental data if you are going to work with the Karen, and then the versions, really version 2 and version 4 depend on which implementation guide kind of framework you want to go with. On the right-hand side is moving now towards the CMS proposed rule, right? Where we now have, when we think about data sources, we're now opening data sources up to all the data that we have on our members, right? It could be, it includes clinical data, it includes any other data, even lab data that we have. So we have to now create a way of standardizing that, and that's where the new common criteria, the USCDI, comes out of. And that's what the data stores that we're going to be talking about going forward and how to standardize those. And then you'll see with these, the push towards version 4, which is more of the DST version 4 of FHIR. So, that idea, that concept of starting with 2 and moving to 4, you're going to have some type of bridging that will allow you to go back and forth or do that mapping. Okay. So this was, I thought, was a great way. If I'm not going to go into it technically, but I think this is a great slide you can actually share with your teams to say what data sources, what subtype, what profile should I be using or resource I should be using, the typical IGs, maybe the work groups that they're from, so Karen or Da Vinci, and then what is the use case? Is it a payer to member, payer to provider, or payer to payer, and what applies? Thought it was a great matrix. I want to give credit to the Da Vinci team for putting this into there, so I'm sharing it with everyone here. But I think if you are going to start planning, you should understand the use cases, the implementation guides that go with that, potentially the FHIR resource that's going to be used, and then that data sources where it's coming from. That would be a good head start on your planning. So possible implementation barriers, right? Where are roadblocks? So we think about how are we going to load our FHIR servers or the actual repositories? Where the data is going to come from? How are you going to do this one-time load, or is it going to be multiple loads, right? How to identify which is your system of record? This even begs the point is, does the FHIR server become a system of record? But I'll leave that up to your teams to make sure if that's something that you even want to broach. Potential FHIR mapping to legacy, enterprise legacy systems. This is a huge deal. The idea that you have maps to the current infrastructure, like an adjudication system, how do you take those current maps and then put those into a FHIR bundle, right? Those are things you have to think about. FHIR versioning, right? Not only FHIR for the claim information, but potentially CCDA or CDA or the clinical mapping to FHIR. Do you want to reuse your FHIR resource or your FHIR bundle? How do you do that? And the tooling is kind of necessary. Think about, don't customize this so you can't scale, because you might make tweaks. You want to try to reuse stuff that you already have. So the tooling and the kind of the mapping that you do, you want to start being to reuse this information so you can kind of get head starts and not start from scratch every time. Make sure you have consent and orchestration integration. If there are third-party apps that you're allowed to download data, right? A Google app, an Apple, or an Apple Health Kit, all of these things, they need to be somehow certified so they work and make sure they're secure. Do you have a registration or certification process for that? Do you want to onboard for that? And then obviously you have to make sure everything's secure and private and enforced, so it has to go through your governance and security teams. All right, so let's think about how we take from where we currently are to the worldwide, to rapid adoption. And if you haven't heard that the ONC now has a task force that's called FAST, FHIR at Scale Task Force. And they're taking on all the use cases that we've kind of mentioned, that I've mentioned, working out of work groups in the industry like Da Vinci, Argonauts, Karen, and other more, even like, even use cases that are not even on the ballot yet. They're taking all those use cases, which typically would be one-on-one pilots at this point, and saying, how do we adopt this into a real world, right? What's the patient matching, provider matching? How are we going to identify those in the real world? How are you going to see directory services of where FHIR servers are located? Version identification, scaling at scale, because it could be millions of transactions. And remember, these are calls and puts, right? These are calls. These aren't going to be sending files. Exchange of processing of the little metadata and flags, conformance, security, all these big tasks that actually bring us into adoption into the industry. This is something that we need to start looking at. And then when you're past the pilots, you need to start looking at how we actually start implementing, and this is a team who's doing it. So I've definitely checked them out. And then finally, for those who think that FHIR is not being adopted, I just want to put it to rest that it is, right? If you haven't found a provider partner or a vendor, right, that you're working with, they have probably implemented FHIR. And I think if you need to work your way back and say, I want to find a partner that I want to do a FHIR pilot with, maybe go find a provider partner that has the technology that has a FHIR installed somewhere or supporting some type of version of FHIR. Start there, or you can actually do some proprietary APIs, which we've kind of fell into as well. But get yourself out there and start piloting use cases, and that's the next step that we're going to talk about, is some of the use cases that are kind of low-hanging fruit. But I just wanted to dispel any rumors that FHIR is not real and and not in production anywhere, since it is. Okay, I think we have one more of my section and we'll load the next survey question. All right, are you planning to implement any of the following reference models? Some of the things I talked about was the CMS, the Blue Button IG, Karen IGs, any of the proposed rules, potentially, Da Vinci use cases, which could be payer provider, and some of the member access rules, and then potentially none of the above. You're going your own route. Maybe you're going down, smart on FHIR stuff and being custom. So let's see how we fare here.
We've got 20% votes in. Make sure y'all get your votes in, and
yeah,
I'll
let's get it going.
Okay.
And after this, you're not going to hear my voice anymore. I'm going to turn it over to Dave, so you can. So this is my last one for this section. How are we doing? I'm seeing the screen, but I'm not seeing the results. So if you could just tell me how we're doing and where we end up at, that would be great. Thanks, Sam.
Yep, we're at 28%. Sorry, it just keeps bouncing up every little bit. I know we have a ton of content to get through, though, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. 29% said Da Vinci use cases. 29% said none of the above. Okay. 18% said Blue Button. 15% said Smart on FHIR, and 9% said Blue Button Karen framework.
So you can see we're all over the place, right? I mean, use cases are going to drive where your planning is. And so, you might think Da Vinci is going to be your IG, but on the other hand, you might say, all right, Blue Button is where I want to start. And it doesn't matter where you start, as long as you start. So I think that's a great cross-section of where people think they need to start from their priorities. So that's good. Thank you very much. So if you get back into mine, and then I'll get over to Dave so you can hear a different voice. Dave, you want to talk about some of the use cases?
Sure. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, go ahead and go to the next slide. So back to the nightmare. And I've been doing clinical data exchange for many, many years, a large part of my career, through HL7 through clinical repositories. And these problems are affecting all members, right? Whether you're a patient, whether you're a beneficiary, you run across these things, as Greg pointed out. I was willingly thrown into the FHIR world because I really do think it solves an information interoperability problem that we have in healthcare, right? And I'm newly exposed to Da Vinci. I won't say I'm an expert, but what you notice on this slide is it's kind of the patient journey, right, that Da Vinci uses. And to protect the innocent, we changed the names. And what we'll walk through is a couple of these use cases. So, you know, again, all the things that Greg mentioned on the bottom in terms of challenges from a member's perspective, I'm going to take that spin of a member perspective. Da Vinci use cases are typically kind of value-based care use cases, of which I've also been working on for the last 5 years. But I'm going to try and take the spin of looking at these from a member perspective and from a member engagement perspective. Next slide. So again, I think the industry's been working on these for a long time, and there's some solutions that are out there. But across the board, what we're trying to get to is a more individualized experience, something that can be consumer directed, so we know where our data is going, kind of powered to the patient, right? Make it more automated so we don't delay in passing the exchange of information and doing manual processes. Hopefully that'll solve some of the timeliness perspective, but there's also new technologies that allow for that used to just be maybe in the provider side that did clinical decision support. Now we're looking at gaps in care and things across the enterprise that impact the member. And then finally having that complete view. So the first use case really is empowering the consumer. And I group this across multiple kind of Da Vinci use cases, right? So the idea of finding a provider, scheduling a provider, and sharing that data across multiple providers. And then finally, when things need to get ordered or some coverage needs to be determined, or me as a member want to know what things are going to cost and where I can make some better decisions on where I spend my dollar for more valued care. I'll go through that first. Go ahead, next slide. So I'll break these up from a challenge perspective and then some of the reference models that are impacting it, and then kind of go back to the member value that the member is going to eventually get out of all these. So the challenge we talked about before, if I'm a member, I got to go out and collect all this information. If I'm going in, whether I'm just applying for insurance or if I'm going in to see a new primary, I got to gather up all this data, whether I'm filling out a form or whatever. But all this information's out there. I got to pull it together. I got to go and kind of use that and figure out, okay, what's going to be the best provider? And then how do I do that scheduling that's going to meet my needs, right? Maybe I need some transportation. Maybe I need certain times over weekends because I can't get there. All that's going to be super important to me, and we got to be able to have that information shared so then I as a member can go find a provider and schedule a visit, right? Or even have my health plan help me schedule a visit. The administrative handouts I talked about, that slows everything down, whether it's scheduling something, whether we're trying to do prior auth, it impacts coverage, right? It impacts cost in the end. And then trying to port those coverages of what kind of care was I getting before, and can I continue that care, right? Maybe the new insurance doesn't cover something. So I want that information when I'm looking out there to make these decisions as a member. The reference kind of things that we do, they're doing it today with Blue Button, the CMS Blue Button 2.0, right? So they securely publish this information out there, and there's over 50 applications that can go get this information. I, as a member, can plug into an app, and it can connect to my data, right, and bring it back to me in a way that hasn't been brought back to me before. They're doing it today. From a Da Vinci perspective, we have the Health Record Exchange, which consists of both payer data exchange, which can be very consumer directed, who I want to know can get my information, and from a clinical data exchange, both from a HIPAA perspective on who needs the data, and then also who I want to share that data with, maybe even outside a payer provider organization. I want to share it with my caretaker. I want to share it with somewhere in my family. And then finally, the idea of coverage requirements discovery, being able to do that from within the workflow, or even from a member perspective. Who should I go be seeing? What kind of cost is it going to be to me if I go see this provider over that provider? And then what kind of pre-authorization type rules or documentation do I need to get things authorized, the whole pre-auth type use case? And then so what does that give me, right? That gives me a complete patient record that's reconciled across my continuum of care from the past going into the future, and as things get added, my record changes and it stays up to date. I get ways of looking for providers, looking for information, looking for coverage that's going to be new to me, and new apps will specialize in new ways of looking at this data that's being exposed. And if I give authorization, there's some powerful new type of applications that we can use this data for to help the member. And then finally, being able to share the patient coverage and treatment information for continuity of care. So we're again, being consistent in how we're treating the patient, and me as a member want to know that can be done. Next slide. So now we'll kind of look at alerts. So alerts are things that kind of, from a Da Vinci perspective, happen in the eligibility and coverage, because it can happen within a provider's workflow where I know that I'm going to need to get some prior auth or some sort of documentation to the payer. But it also can happen at the point of care, right? So when I get discharged, when I'm going into surgery, certain things that could have impacted in the past can now be fired on, which is done kind of inside the hospital today. But what if I'm going to see a new provider? What care alerts does the payer need to know about, so I don't have to keep going in to see different providers just to get taken care of? So we'll talk about those timely alerts. Next slide. Again, the challenges is kind of the history. We've been able to do, and I've been doing HL7 V2 since the early 90s, ADTs inside the four walls. It works great. We can do clinical decision support. We can do a lot of things, but what happens when we go outside that care? And there's been some rules around transition of care with CCDs and things like that, and it's kind of worked, but it's not going across the enterprise. So in the second bullet, being able to collaborate with all these different entities that impact my care is going to be important to me as a member. The untimely interventions, obviously a problem, and then getting that information either to me as a member or to my provider in the context of care. So it's not after I went and visited the provider that he has to come back and bring me back in for some additional assessment or something like that. Next slide. How Da Vinci solves it, again, is with the clinical data exchange. They have alerts and notifications, which they have use cases for admit discharge type things, clinical and administrative events. With the FHIR APIs, they've also included things like CDS hooks to be able to have resources and send cards back in the context of the workflow. And those cards and information could include things like recommendations. They can include links to these new Smart on FHIR applications, which again kind of extend the ability of an application to go across multiple EMRs or multiple sets of data that are FHIR based. We detect events, and then we provide relevant information from that event, so the context, right, to the endpoints of interest, who's subscribing to this. A pub sub model and a push model are part of the alert in Da Vinci. Next slide. And finally, the member value. Obviously, if I'm getting better care, I won't go through all these, but everything's available right at the point, and the interventions are very, very timely, right? We can identify patients and populations at higher risk earlier. We can get those care gaps taken care of, which helps both the member and the provider to meet certain quality metrics, and then in the end saves costs, right? We can have individualized alerts, both for the member and for the provider, to alert to reduce the alert fatigue that we're seeing right now for providers. And also, on a day-to-day basis, we're getting alerts on our phone. So if we start thinking that we're going to get member alerts, great, more power to the patient, but we can't have too many. We got to be able to weed through them. Next slide. And then finally, the last case is kind of bringing it all together, right? Is taking all this information when I'm discharged from the hospital or something, and letting others know what still needs to be done, and giving them that complete continuity of care that I experienced from the very beginning, or even my history before the beginning of this journey, right, until this very end when I'm getting discharged. I want to make sure that I'm going to stay well and stay healthy out beyond the discharge or my visit to the hospital. Next slide. And so the use case is medication reconciliation, which many people identify as a quality measure in many different value-based contracts. But the challenge is collecting all this information, collecting accurate information, because there's different sources. Prescriptions are out there. Did they get refilled? What's my adherence, right? Who am I asking on what kind of medication am I taking? Over time, different pharmacies that I may have gone to. Am I asking because it's an elderly patient? Maybe I'm asking their adult child. Maybe it's a child. I'm asking their adult parent. So I may get different stories. This is also important just post-discharge, right? To make sure that we have that reconciliation. It impacts care. It impacts the risk of getting, some medication errors. It impacts cost, right? I'm maybe prescribing too much. At the bottom, you have omissions, duplications, dosing errors. Things that can happen with medications can be very severe. Next slide. So the use cases out of Da Vinci, the implementation guides include data exchange for quality measures. So medication reconciliation is just one of those that has been built out and is in different use cases. They have the medication reconciliation post-charge kind of processes that show how the data can be in different places and how we bring that all together and can be presented as a medication reconciliation and then be attested by the provider. Next slide. The value of the member obviously is having a complete set of records. In this case, it's medical records, but it could be the whole set of your medical record, right? And then making more appropriate prescriptions, more appropriate care plans for the member. You keep a closer watch on medication adherence, and then watch for both provider and member abuse of those. And we can catch those things a lot earlier when we have a full view of that medication list. Next slide. So I did quickly go through those. On the left, we kind of hit a couple other use cases that are a part of Blue Button and Da Vinci. But all these use cases are built on the FHIR APIs, right? So depending on which reference model you may be using to collect and manage some of the data or build applications out of the data that's behind these FHIR APIs, right? It could be depending on which line of business you may be sharing with. It could be depend on you following different ONC or CMS proposed rules, building out smart apps, or even just following the Da Vinci use cases. There'll be maps. There'll be other things in the back end. These things aren't going away. I could go look at HL7 V2 code that I've written back in the early 90s, and I bet I can still find that code in place inside hospitals. So I know these things are out there. The key is having the mappings and making sure that it remains consistent and that we're all looking for a common goal with common standards. Next slide. So establishing the common goals, right? If we're all looking to do the same thing, these kind of top value point or top goals are goals of every plan these days. I mean, and provider, right? And even in some cases, members are trying to get these things right. What we really focused on today was the member and around the care of that member and what's going to make that member experience that much better. So these are the things I think that we all work toward, whether we're a health plan, whether we're a provider, whether we're a member, we all strive to meet these goals. Next slide. And that takes us to survey question number 3. And what is the top priority use cases, which I went through a couple of them here, that your organization, maybe if you're looking to prioritize these, which would be the top one you're looking to tackle? That would be kind of just the overall patient data exchange. I think we heard many of you exposing it currently today. So maybe that's not the top priority if you're already doing it. Maybe it's solving the prior auth or coverage dilemmas, or getting more timely alerts and gaps in care to those the care team that needs it, the stakeholders, or maybe it's a medication reconciliation type use case. I feel like playing that Jeopardy song right now.
I know. Do. We kind of have that.
That sounded like doing it.
Oh, it's interesting.
So good, yeah. A prior auth has been on the slate for a long time. I know CORE's tried to address it. We internally have different solutions around it. But yeah, absolutely. I think Da Vinci taking a running leap at this thing. And if you look through that implementation guide and all the things that are a part of it, it's a lot of great work. And again, just to, not to leave you in the dark, there's people out there doing these things. You should join up with the group, see what's going on the HL7 sites, Karen, Da Vinci, whatever your use cases are. There's a lot of good information out there. I encourage you to go look at it. And I'll turn it back over to Greg.
Excellent, Dave. Thanks so much. And it's good to get, your perspective, because a lot of times, when we come on these calls, we take more of an industry or, a traditional payer approach, right, for claims. But I'd love to hear the clinical side and how it all comes together. So I appreciate you giving you that experience and bringing that knowledge. All right, so we have 4 minutes left, and some of you have maybe seen this, and really it's like now kind of self-judging, like where you are kind of on this process. And by no means, right, is this a foolproof kind of, assessment, but it gives you an idea of where we kind of came, where you might be going, and where you might be lacking in some of your support. And we've presented this a couple of times, and I'll quickly go over, what it means. At bottom left-hand corner, and we start with who we're talking about. Really, it's the patient-centric data, or the people, right, and the consumer here. And what happens is at the bottom is we store data in all these different repositories, as I mentioned, and it could be stored, across existing transactional standardized data, like, in clouds or even CRMs. And then we have to somehow normalize this data for care, as we were just mentioning, as Dave did a job of mentioning from a care perspective, a point of care, normalizing this data. On the left-hand side, we have to figure out who we share this data with, right, or how we get the information to be interoperable. And so we've started with partners, right? We started with clearinghouses. Now we're moving to IoT, we're moving to mobile, we're moving to more REST-based type of stuff. So in the middle, right, left to right, a few years ago, the whole big push, and maybe now it's just for the Fed teams, right, is like, modernization, right? How are we modernizing our front ends? How are we modernizing what we've already invested in? How are we moving to real-time transactions? Are we, kind of creating omni-channels and consolidating so we don't have too many, technologies doing the same thing? I mean, are we meeting the, kind of core best practices moving into that prior authorization and, kind of operating 4 and 5, right? Are we utilizing these infrastructures for clinical edits up front, right? Is there cost savings to do, higher level edits up front? And then self-service and structured data, right? Gone are the days of taking in a scan and not being able to do anything with it, right? Or a fax, unless we're OCRing it. We want to really get that data so it can be usable. So that's modernization and compliance, right? I mean, I think everyone should self-assess themselves pretty well on that, or at least have a plan. Middle is, a couple of years ago, we started pushing, this whole clinical data integration. And so we've had projects pop up, and like, how do I integrate HL7 data into my claim data, right? How do I do direct messaging, right? How am I going to connect to an HIE at that time? Now it's going to turn into a trusted exchange, right? How do I correlate claims with my clinical data under a member? Have I done RFAI or this attachment well enough to meet, what I need for, my payer network, right? From my experience with, or internal use. And then, am I using all this information effectively for HEDIS, right? And chart reviews and the site. So is it being used effectively? So that could be a hard one, right? I mean, if it's not your area. But you can see here we've done clinical data integration. Now we're into APIs, and in the future we're going to be powered members. So I'm at the 3 o'clock hour. I try to respect your time. We do have stuff online, right, that we think that you can go out and help kind of assess yourself. So we've just built this. We're so excited that marketing team got it out. So thanks, Mary, for getting this out. You have a link to this, so go test it, see if it works, give us some feedback on it, give yourself a self-assessment, and use that information internally with your teams. And then, best practices, understand the impacts, develop your plan, a roadmap, step-by-step checklist that we've kind of shared with you, and really start finding a use case and a partner to go and do some pilots with. If I encourage you one thing is start planning and start interacting. So I don't think we have time for the last question. It's 3 o'clock, so I'll just kind of pop off. Unless we want to do the last question, Sam, I want to respect everyone's time. It is 3 o'clock.
We can launch it real quick, and if folks that want to answer it we'll give them a few seconds to answer.
And I'll just apologize, friend. I knew we had a lot of content to cover, but we will do our due diligence in taking all of the questions. If you have any, email us or put them in the chat channel. We'll put them all, and we'll do our best to answer all those and just distribute that via email. I knew we probably weren't going to get to Q&A today. So the last question really would be like, what section does your company require the most attention? So you saw the 4, right? Is it really modernizing that front end? Is it really the clinical data integration, ingesting, and correlation? Are you struggling with the API development and standardizing APIs and in this NPRM kind of world where access rules? And then, or are you really, struggling with how you're going to support innovative applications in the future? So these kind of idea of a smart app or an empowered app, or like we talked about, how data could be massaged and looked at differently through a versatile different types of ways. Are you kind of concerned on how that would work? So I'll just throw that up there, and it looks like no one cares about D. That's good. All right, so we're not into the member empowerment. Looks like EDI monetization rules, right? Am I seeing that correct, Sam? People are still focused on modernization and compliance.
Yep.
And then comes clinical data. So, which is fair, right? I mean, we've been doing this for a while, and so it should be the attention. So don't forget about API, but understand that you are on a journey, and there are there are phases to this. And so we appreciate everyone's time. I apologize we couldn't get to the questions, but I'm glad that many people stayed on for the hour. And like I did, thank you again. And get out there and start being interoperable. Go to the webinars and go to Connect-a-thons and go connect. So Sam, thank you very much for putting this together.
Thank you to our fantastic presenters, and just so all the attendees know, I'll be following up with the slide deck, and then once they have answered the questions, that usually comes in a PDF, and I'll be sending those documents out to you as well. So thank you again, everybody, for your participation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week.